Hi there. As you probably heard me speaking a few moments ago, my name is Lita Downs from the Center for Faculty Excellence. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Guiding Dissertation Students to Successfully Conducting Delphi Research. Today's presenter, Dr. Kenneth Sherman, is a contributing faculty member in the PhD in Management program in the College of Management and Technology. But before I hand things over to Dr. Sherman, I would like to review a few housekeeping items in Adobe. As you can see, the main content for today's presentation will be in the center screen in the large box. There's also a file share that does not appear on this slide, but you'll see it on your screen, where Dr. Sherman has included a data reduction map that he will be referring to later. So you can click on that file share and download that document for yourself for future use. There's also a chat box. Dr. Sherman will be addressing questions, but at different times throughout the presentation. So if you do have a question, you can type them in the chat box, and I'll collect them to give to Dr. Sherman throughout the presentation. There is a raise hand function, as you can see, if you need a presenter to possibly speak up or slow down, or maybe just want to give Dr. Sherman a round of applause, please feel free to use that function. Lastly, there is a help button if you should encounter any technical difficulties. There's a wealth of information that hopefully will remedy that problem. And lastly, one thing I forgot to mention, we have Megan from Paradigm. Thank you so much, Megan, for transcribing for us today, and you'll see her transcriptions in the upper left-hand side of the screen. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sherman.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Lita. And thank you, everybody, for joining me today. It's great to see quite a number of familiar names. I think I've been around here too long, but and for those who I don't know, it's nice to meet all of you. One of the challenges with today's presentation is that some of you are more familiar with Delphi design than others. The focus of the presentation is how to help students avoid landmines when doing Delphi research. So that presupposes some understanding of Delphi research. So what I'm going to try to do very quickly is give everybody sort of Delphi in a toolbox for the first 9 slides of the presentation, and then get into the landmines. And I'm going to talk about at least the top 10 landmines that I encounter when I work with students. And hopefully we'll be able to bring everybody along within the presentation. By the end of the hour, I hope that each of you will be able to explain the appropriateness of a Delphi design, understand some of the basic characteristics of a Delphi study, list the variations. There's no 2 Delphis that are ever alike, and all are correct if they're appropriately assembled and cited with methodological protocols. Describe the pros and cons of the Delphi technique. Some love it, some do not. And getting into the heart of the presentation, which is to explain landmines to avoid and working with students when planning a Delphi study. And finally, I'm going to share with you some of the Delphi resources that I find invaluable, and some of them are actually free and downloadable in terms of book form on the internet. So that's what I have on the docket for today. I'll pause after the first 9 slides and ask for questions, and then again we'll bring up some questions towards the end. For those who are more experienced with Delphi, please jump in and share your experiences. The more we can share and exchange with each other, I think the better the session. Let me preface by saying that there is, again, no right or wrong approach per se, as long as it's methodologically sound. So I cannot account today for every variation on Delphi. I'm going to explain to you some of the basic approaches, which is not to say there aren't other ways of doing or conducting Delphi studies. And I thought that I would like to begin by creating a shared experience with everybody, particularly for those who are less familiar with Delphi. So Lita, if we can bring over this PowerPoint, thank you, and I believe I'm able to control. So let's just say hypothetically that I've assembled everybody in the room, and you're not known to each other, you can't see your names, but I'm introducing and soliciting participation in a study sponsored by a university, and I'm soliciting all of you potentially to be experts in a panel that's going to be part of my study. And the purpose of my study, and this will be what we'll call a qualitative conventional Delphi study, is I'm going to evaluate consensus amongst all of you, and I'm going to seek solutions from you as to desirable and feasible tools and techniques for building engagement among doctoral students in an online classroom. And to do that, with that purpose, I've created a research question with 4 subcomponents, which is what tools and techniques are desirable and feasible for building engagement among doctoral students in an online classroom. And I'm going to deconstruct that research question into 4 components. So we're going to look at what are, and the first one does, see, this is where researchers can have to be careful. So the first one, actually the first one is written right. My apologies. So I'm going to ask what are the desirable, in fact, in this case, it's going to be what are the desirable tools, or what tools are desirable for building engagement. And then we're going to ask what tools are feasible for building engagement. And then we're going to ask what techniques are desirable for building engagement. And we're going to look at what techniques are feasible for building engagement. So that's the premise or the basis of my study that all of you are going to hypothetically be involved in. So the next methodological consideration that I would have to think about is, what are the criteria for selecting my experts? What qualifies you as an expert? So I might consider that number of years teaching in an online environment. It could be student ratings on an end of course survey at a certain level. It could be that you have experience in utilizing certain software products off of, let's say, an Office 365 platform. It could be that you have certain certifications or degrees, and so on and so forth. But I'll come up with my list of criteria. In this case, I'm going to ask my participants to self-select into the study. So I'm going to send out a list of the criteria, and I'm going to ask you to mark it off as to whether you met the criteria. I'm going to do it through an online survey platform like SurveyMonkey. And if, in fact, you meet the criteria, the platform will advance you to an informed consent document where you'll be able to indicate or acknowledge your agreement. I'm not going to ask you for your name per se, but I'm going to ask you to come up with an identifier that you'll be able to use for future surveying that's going to go on during the study as one way to sort of protect anonymity. You're not going to know who else is participating in this study. Everything will remain anonymous amongst the participants. So right off the bat, I've got a purpose for my study. I've got 4 research questions that I want to answer. I have set up criteria as to what constitutes an expert, and I've gone out and through the cooperation and permissions of a university, they've granted me access to a group of their faculty who have now self-selected into my study. So I'm going to begin, this is what's called the conventional Delphi study. So I'm going to begin with my first round of data collection, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to ask you 6 questions administered again online. So an example might be for tools. I might say to you, what types of synchronous tools foster engagement among doctoral students in an online classroom? It's semi-structured, open-ended. You'll answer me in the SurveyMonkey environment, and you'll write in your answer to the question. I'm going to ask you 2 other questions as well about engagement, and then I'll ask you 3 questions, open-ended again, about techniques. So what student-centric practices build discussion in an online classroom? And again, you'll answer those 3 questions and submit them back to me electronically. What I then do, and let's say I've selected 24 of you to be in my study. So I have 24, 25 participants in the study. I then take all of your responses and I do a thematic content analysis to look for consistency of responses. And amongst all of the responses, there's maybe 50 to 60 ideas for tools and techniques that seem to be repetitive amongst the participants. What I then do is I take or assemble a list of all of those ideas, and I want to keep tools and I want to keep techniques separate. So I'm going to have a list of tools, I'm going to have a list of techniques. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to create a Likert type survey instrument, and I'm going to ask you for each item to rate your agreement as to the desirability and the feasibility of each item. So here you'll see that I'm going to give you a 5-point Likert scale where a 5 would be strongly disagree, a 4 would be disagree, a 3 would be neither agree or disagree, a 2 would be agree, and a 1 would be strongly agree. And I'm going to list in 20 techniques, and in this example, I'm going to list 20 different tools. So the first technique would be student-hosted discussion questions. And you would rate whether or not you believe they're desirable and whether or not they're feasible. Remember, that which is always desirable isn't necessarily feasible, and that which is feasible isn't always necessarily desirable. So when I do a study, I like to kind of separate those two constructs. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I could have just said evaluate your agreement as to effectiveness. Or other criteria or filters on these items. And the same thing with tools. So in this case, I would list maybe 20, 25 different tools, and I would ask you again to rate the desirability or the feasibility and the feasibility of each tool. Here's an example, content curation software. So again, this would be administered through the SurveyMonkey platform. You would enter your identifier onto the survey. The data would come back to me. I'd download it into an Excel document, and I would start to evaluate the data for consensus. And as you're going to hear later on in the presentation, there's lots of different ways to do that. I'm going to use very basic descriptive statistics, and in this case, I'm going to use frequencies, and I'm going to use a median score. And we'll talk again a little bit later about the pros and cons of some of those different tools or statistics to use. But in this case, I'm going to look to see where if 70% of you, this is a hurdle that I'm going to look at to assess consensus or agreement. Remember, my purpose up here is to evaluate consensus. That's the end goal that I want to get to. So I'm going to look at frequency of response and to see if 70% of my participants either agree or strongly agree with each item. So again, using these different scales. They need to meet both requirements. So they need to be deemed desirable and feasible by 70% of my participants. In instances where the hurdle is not met, I introduce a second test, which is I look at median scores. And the reason that I do that is there may be some items, perhaps my participants are not familiar with content curation software. So despite their expertise, and many of them, circled and neither agree nor disagree, which depress my agree and my strongly disagree percentages. But of those who are familiar with content curation software, they agree and strongly agree that it is an effective tool for engagement. So what I introduce is a median score or filter, and I look for a median to be at a score of 3.5 or greater, which would then show me, or 3.5 or in this case lower, that the filter would basically show me that there is a tendency towards consensus. For those items that have a tendency towards consensus, I would move them into a third round of data collection. And in this round, I might say, again, go through another rating process. I may have asked you as participants if you rated, something where you disagreed to explain why, and I may decide to give everybody the results of the group. I may not. I may ask you to kind of rate or comment on where you felt strongly about items, why you did, and I may share or control the feedback that I give to you for the next round. Again, that's optional, up to the researcher. But in the next round, I'm going to send you the list again of those items that passed the filter in round 2. And in round 3, I may ask you to rank your top 5 preferences, or I could ask you to re-rate all your items again. And at the end of that round, I'll go through again the measuring and the filtering process in an attempt to come up with a final conclusion about consensus as to the most desirable and feasible elements of a program to build engagement among doctoral students. So this is just a little bit of a shared example and a backdrop to look at how a Delphi, one way among many ways to build a Delphi study. I'm looking here at some of the questions. Craig, yes, there are other types of Delphi studies beyond conventional, and I have a slide coming up on that. And hi, Cheryl. So do we use software such as NVivo? Absolutely. Depending on the number of participants, I like to do it. There's a couple of ways you can actually do it. You can do it manually. You could, in fact, ask 2 colleagues who are credentialed in addition to you to do it manually, and you could look for some sort of comparisons to see if you're all in sync with each other, and you can basically run it through NVivo as well. Okay, so that's your sort of context for Delphi for those of you who are less familiar with Delphi. So what I'd like to do, Lita, is go back now to the slides, and let's talk about the Delphis. And Mr. Page, I see that I use the term evaluated. There's many different terms that sometimes are used. You could also use the term, the purpose is to build consensus. Some may, though, feel that that is a little bit biased, could be potentially biased on the part of the researcher, that they're attempting to kind of force consensus. So that word or term has a little bit of controversy associated with it. And then you could certainly use to analyze and interpret consensus. Absolutely. Okay, let's go on to look at the next slide. So what are the characteristics of a Delphi study? It's exactly what you just saw. There's anonymity. You noticed that I talked about the use of identifiers, and the participants are not visible to each other. There is iteration, so there's multiple rounds of data collection. There is controlled feedback, so I determine exactly what I want to share with you in terms of the results of the prior round of data collection. And there's a form of statistical response in terms of the measurement of consensus. And now I will say that probably in about 5% of all Delphi studies, there is qualitative analysis only with each round. So the researcher is not using means, medians, or other types of non-parametric measures to assess consensus. But they are looking to take the qualitative responses and then ask another series of questions with more qualitative responses. That's not a conventional Delphi, and I would say if a student ever approached me about doing a study like that, it would probably be because they have fear of means and medians, which we can talk about separately. But there would have to be a very, very strong reason and justification for not using those conventional techniques to measure central tendency. Okay, so these are the 4 characteristics that we look for in a Delphi study. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Delphi. So Delphi is a millennial, is a baby boomer. It was born in the 1950s, and its parent is the Rand Corporation. So unlike other forms of qualitative research where there's a germinal base of thought leaders like the Mustakises or the Heideggers and so on of the world, Delphi was born in a corporation. And that has implications because when we go and we try to look at the literature, we're not going to necessarily find these massive library collections of books written about Delphi study. The knowledge and the evolution of Delphi was really performed by methodologists, both in the corporate arena and in the academic arena, who evolved the design. In its infancy, at birth, Delphi was actually, Rand Corporation was involved. This is the company that you probably know for yellow Post-it notes and so on and so forth. But they also do a lot of research directly with the US government. And going back to the 1950s, shades of Cold War, they assembled a group to look at forecasting techniques for the military production of A-bombs and looking at military fortification. That soon into the adolescence of Delphi branched, and Delphi became or expanded as a forecasting technique, looking typically at scientific breakthroughs over a 50-year planning horizon. And as Delphi began to morph and grow in age and moved into early adulthood, by the 1970s, over 1,500 Delphi studies were done with expanded disciplines into sociology, psychology, operations research, economics, and so on and so forth. So it definitely had a morphing technique in terms of utilization and scope. Delphi today, there is thousands of studies. I went in to try to even find a number, but everything is so disciplined, broken down by discipline, it was virtually impossible to do that. Another challenge in looking at or trying to ascertain Delphi usage is if you go into search, you have to be careful with the search terms because in some cases you'll see Delphi is referred to as a method. In other cases, you may see the Delphi technique. You may go in and search for the Delphi approach. There's the Delphi design. And then outside of Delphi, some studies will incorporate a Delphi technique but will bill themselves as a case study. And in other cases, because there's the iterative or mixed data collection sometimes, which is not the same necessarily as a mixed method, but in terms of the sequencing of the data collection, it may be viewed as a sequential mixed method study. So some researchers will call it mixed methods. So it's very hard to basically get a handle on the total number of Delphis that are out there. But needless to say, today it's recognized that there's thousands of studies and it covers and encompasses all disciplines. There's no recognized thought leaders for Delphi. Again, you want to go and look at papers that are not per se Delphi studies, but they are papers written by methodologists about the efficacy of the Delphi design or about the variations of Delphi technique that have been employed. There is the classical or conventional Delphi that I described, which typically, again, variations in how it's interpreted, but the best that I can see in terms of the interpretation is where it's that open-ended first round of data collection followed by subsequent rounds of data collection where you are trying to empirically measure consensus. There is something called a decision-making Delphi. Often this is used by companies where the participants are known to each other in terms of who's participating in the study. So back to my example that I gave you, if I made this a Walden study, and if I opened it up that the panelists knew who was participating in the study, and the intent of the study was to adopt these tools and techniques and make some decisions about curriculum design for the next 12 months, That would be a decision-making Delphi. What probably would not happen, though, is you would not see who responded with what during the study. You might only know who participated in the study. But the outcome of the study would be to make a series of decisions relative to program development. There's something also called a modified Delphi. I'm a frequent user of this design with students when there is a fair amount of research that's already been conducted on the topic, and there are lots of solutions. So if there were lots of solutions already on tools and techniques for building engagement, and I was able to come up with, a couple of dozen that are well documented and saturated in the literature, there's really no point in me going out and asking everybody to give their ideas again from scratch. What I might do as part of a lit review is pull together and document all of those ideas and create that list of items that I showed you, which emerge from that thematic content analysis, if I did this open-ended, and begin my first round by giving my panel the list of ideas and asking my panel if they wanted to add to the list. So I'm sort of modifying that first round of Delphi, of data collection for my Delphi. There's other interpretations as to what a modified Delphi may be, and as I said, there's a lot of variation, but typically it's, in my opinion, it's the modification that will also go on with that first round of how data is initially collected. There's something also called a policy Delphi. And policy Delphi, I'm starting to get my arms wrapped around. Again, depending on who you read, what you read, and by whom, there's some variation in the explanation of a policy Delphi as well. But my understanding and interpretation of a policy Delphi is that it's the antithesis of the conventional Delphi. You are not looking to measure, evaluate, analyze, or interpret consensus. What you're attempting to do is analyze and evaluate divergence of responses, such that when policymakers go out and try to introduce policy, they understand all of the various opinions and thoughts and rationales of stakeholders who may be affected by the policy or may have an influence in crafting the policy. So it's fairly nuanced, and if anybody is looking to do a policy Delphi, I would recommend you go out and do a lot of front-end reading as to how those studies are conducted. It's not just a matter of going out and doing Likert. There's a lot of financial data and analysis that's also brought into it. And finally, there's the e-Delphi, and sometimes you'll also read about real-time Delphi. E-Delphi technically is defined as a Delphi study that's administered electronically. Well, today, because, again, versus the 1950s and 70s and such, most Delphi studies are administered electronically. So the difference between a conventional Delphi and an e-Delphi is rather blurred in my mind. I sort of look at the conventional classical description. But there's also a real-time Delphi. So if I had the software and I was able to get 25 of you and say to you, come online Thursday at noon Eastern time, and in this SurveyMonkey or other type of software, rate your agreements in real time, and like the stock market, look at the results and then re-rate them again, and do this synchronously, we would be conducting a Delphi in real time. Needless to say, you don't see a lot of that, because to get 25 experts to agree to show up at a certain time and to have the software that can do those kinds of manipulations become very, very difficult. The estimate of Delphi dissertations in the UMI database, I believe, is most likely understated. The one reference that I was able to find estimated it at 200 doctoral dissertations that were done between 2014 and 2015. Again, the researcher of that study specifically searched using the term, in abstracts only, using the term Delphi design, and did not look for Delphi method, Delphi approach, mixed methods, employing Delphi technique, and so on and so forth. But needless to say, Delphi is getting a lot of bandwidth today amongst doctoral students as a viable research technique. Okay, let's go forward, and I'm going to move this along very quickly. What is my background in Delphi? I was the co-investigator of a published study in an APA journal in which Delphi was used to define success for organizational diversity issues. Today, a lot of corporations invest hundreds of millions of dollars in diversity training, but ask a head of HR or an executive in an organization as to how you would define success of organizational diversity initiatives or success of training, you might not get a clear-cut answer. And this brought together 35 consultants in diversity to attempt to come up with those definitions and measures for success. On a practical basis, as a consultant in a corporation, I've led Delphi to inform the strategic planning for 3 different degree programs for a university. A university was building out master's degrees and doctoral degrees and wanted to use the development that was informed by the subject matter expertise of its faculty as well as externals to the academic institution. And we brought together a Delphi panel to look at programmatic objectives, course development, course descriptions to attempt again to build a consensus. And I also worked as a consultant and as a faculty member, in this case, for another university that was looking to inform strategic actions for addressing dissertation progression of students and how to accelerate that progression. And we did a Delphi study for that. And we again looked at desirability and feasibility. And that was an interesting study because that which was deemed to be desirable was not necessarily deemed to be feasible within the resources of the university. So how do we take something that's desirable and not feasible and make it feasible was very important in terms of the analysis and interpretation of the data. And so here's a question: are there specific types of topics that are best suited for Delphi? If so, what advantage does Delphi have? Okay, so let's hold that question, please, because that's coming up in a slide momentarily. I've chaired Delphi studies, so as an example, cross-cultural adaptation strategies for Western expatriates in China. China has the highest failure rate of any country in terms of expats who go over and don't even finish the first year tour of duty. Elements of a chief nursing officer succession plan within one of the largest hospital systems in the nation. And today I'm working with a student at Walden on reevaluating certification competencies for geospatial industry professionals relative to Industry 4.0. This student is just on the brink of submitting her prospectus for approval to the program director. Based upon her topic, she was accepted to speak, and she spoke back in July at the largest geospatial industry conference attended by 15,000 industry professionals who basically saw such value in this topic in terms of a forward-looking projection of certification standards in the industry. She was accepted to speak even without having conducted her study yet. So there's a lot of bandwidth, as you can see, and a lot of variation in terms of Delphi. Okay, so back to the question, what advantages when it's appropriate? There's typically, Delphi is used to assess long-term issues. When we look and focus students on gaps in the literature, we're looking at instances either where this is a brand new emerging issue, such as competencies for Industry 4.0 for certification in the geospatial industry. There's limited evidence. It could be in the literature that there's many opposing views. So there's lots of different ideas, but different schools of thought on how to approach this solution to this complex problem. Or another type of gap in the literature could be what I call scholar-practitioner gaps. So in my China example, expatriate adaptation has been studied for decades. It goes back to Hofstede and others in terms of cross-cultural practices and training. The problem has been written about for several decades. Many solutions have been proposed by the academic community, and yet on the practitioner side, the problem persists. So there's a scholar-practitioner gap, and again, we're looking to convene a panel of experts to pull together and assemble a list of solutions. It could also be that model-based statistical options for addressing forecasting or projections are not available relative to the topic. So again, bringing together experts and establishing some sort of consensus amongst the experts is critical. Typically, the gap in the literature and the basis for doing the study will fall into one of these four gaps in the literature. We reduce the other instance where Delphi may be appropriate is when we try to reduce solutions to complex problems to individual components. So in the example that we looked at about engagement of doctoral students in online classrooms, it's a fairly complex problem. There's many different approaches. We, with our itemization, are trying to come up with individual components for a solution. A Delphi is also appropriate when experts lack communication exchange outlets. They don't have a platform or a venue to communicate with each other, or they do communicate with each other and the communication is largely dysfunctional. And it's also appropriate when there's limited resources to convene a large group and bring the experts together. The use of the electronic survey platform is efficient and cost effective. So this is when a Delphi is appropriate. You may ask me now, when is a Delphi not appropriate? A Delphi is not appropriate when direct communication amongst participants is desirable, when the focus is on current best practices. Again, this is my interpretation, but as a URR, if I saw a study coming in saying that there was a Delphi study to develop consensus on best practices, my response would be best practices are here and now. Delphi is forward-looking. It's the future. So we're looking to look at future practices, not best practices today. It's also not appropriate when we're trying to explain antecedent behaviors leading up to the problem. Why does this problem exist? That, to me, would be more akin to a case study, not to a Delphi study. If we're seeking pure scientific evidence, a Delphi would not be appropriate. And a Delphi would not be appropriate relative to the execution if there's difficulty in assessing expertise of panelists or if there's barriers to participation. So we know that we have a small group of potential experts. Their time is really tight. They're not going to want to devote to taking multiple surveys. Let's not begin even attempt to do this Delphi study. Those would be some typical barriers. Let's continue. So, Lita, if you can move over this map, and I'm going to scroll to the top. This is, again, and I sort of covered this already, so I'm going to go through this fast for the sake of time. But this is going to kind of conclude the introduction. You'll see numbers on this slide, and the numbers are pitfalls, and where the pitfalls can occur and the landmines can occur when advising a student or guiding a student through a Delphi study. So let me go ahead and go through this quickly. We talked about this initially. We begin with our research questions. We go ahead and we determine we want to try to do 3 rounds of data collection. We develop our open-ended questionnaire. We basically also look at, in this case, we chose a 5-point Likert type survey. There's 7 points, there's 9 points, there's even 4 points or even numbers. Those typically tend to force a respondent to make a decision. So I like to introduce an odd number where there's a neutral position in the scale. We came up with the expert criteria. We identify a sample frame, and we go out and we do all the necessary protections to enlist participants for a study, and we create the round 1 Delphi. We go through the round 1 data collection. We contact the subject matter experts, get them on board, and we go out and we administer that open-ended questionnaire that I showed you regarding, in the example I gave, tools and techniques. The information comes back in, and we do thematic coding and content analysis of the responses, and we develop a round 2 survey, which will list those items, and against it we'll put it into a 5-point Likert type item or survey format, and we will again push that out electronically through our survey platform, and we will ask our participants to rate. And the key word here, sometimes students get confused and they'll say rank when they're really asking the participant to rate. So we're going to ask our participants to rate their agreement with the different items. And we're going to again have the measures or the hurdles that we're going to use to evaluate consensus. So in this case, we talked about measures of central tendency, medians, and frequency percentages. We go ahead and we analyze the responses for the frequencies or for the median scores. And again, we move those over to a third round of data collection. So those items that pass the hurdle will get sent out electronically again, and we may ask our participants to re-rate, or we may ask them to rank the top 5 elements or fundamentals. If we're using a ranking, we then switch into a weighted mean calculation, and we examine individual ranking variations, and we use standard deviations. And finally, we disseminate the results of the study, the analysis and the interpretation from Mr. Page. And then we frame our conclusions and our recommendations. So a couple of questions. Are there quantitative Delphis? Are they different from qualitative? So Cheryl, in this case, in this example, it's mixed data. So the first round of data collection was qualitative, and then we get into quantitative use of, in this case, basic descriptive statistics. There's also, in some cases, some researchers will use non-parametric statistics. They'll also use, they'll do a Cronbach alpha to look at internal validity of the instruments. So there's varying levels of sophistication. But for my preference, I typically have the students use the basic descriptive statistics. Are there conferences for Delphi researchers, communities of practice? Absolutely. And if you, the one place I would refer you to immediately is to the RAND Corporation and their website. You'll see a whole set of resources regarding Delphi research, and I'm going to share with you some other resources shortly. And are there specific topics that are best suited? Again, we went through the when it's appropriate, not appropriate. It's always forward-looking. It's not appropriate for antecedents. It's not appropriate necessarily for best practices. So Cheryl asks, would the dissertation be referred to as mixed methods? Again, you're going to see variations on that. It's not to say calling it mixed methods would be incorrect. That I would check with the methodologist within your college or program. I typically tend to call it a qualitative study with a Delphi design is the way I have my students do it. And the reason I call it qualitative is the first round of data collection is based upon the subjective opinions of experts, which is qualitative. And then we expose those opinions and thoughts to a basic analysis using descriptive statistics. So it's mixed data within a qualitative research method. That's the way I would view it. Vicky asks about minimum numbers and percents. We're going to come up to that in a moment, so hang tight. And let's move on to the next slide. Lita, if we can go back to the right. Okay, so we have the map. Variations. There is no one way to do a Delphi study. So the variations in the map that I just showed you could be the criteria for an expert. And this is where Delphis are heavily criticized, that, oh boy, the criteria, the expertise criteria was really lax. The researcher brought in, their aunts, their cousins, their uncles, and neighbors. The panel size will vary. We'll talk about that in a moment. The number of rounds of data collection, the nature of the information you're soliciting, again, control feedback, how much feedback you're going to give between the rounds, the types of scales that you're using. I gave you an example where I use dual scales. Sometimes you can use one scale. Sometimes you can alter the scales. And then how you measure consensus. There is no one right or consistent approach to doing Delphi. By the way, I'm going to point you to a resource in the resource list that I use as my Bible. It's the best $29.95 I've ever invested in. This author basically goes through all these variations and points to the different studies and what the latest thinking is. It's a gold mine of a resource. So hang on. There's a cliffhanger to continue. All right, guiding students, landmines to avoid. And so here's the top 10 list. First of all, avoiding landmines is a learning process. How do I know about these landmines? I've chaired students who have experienced these landmines. Landmines may vary based upon the methodological choice, and each landmine is numbered and cross-referenced to the table, which you'll get as part of the handouts. And above all, please remember to follow the Walden checklist guidelines. So these are not the only criteria for doing a good Walden study. It's got to meet and adhere to the research criteria and guidelines on the qualitative checklists that we all know and use regularly. So we're not going to, I am not repeating. This is just the added nuances particular to the design. So the first question, the first landmine, managing for panelist dropout. I would say, based on experience, leave enough cushion in panel size to allow for a 25% dropout rate. A lot of people will sign on to a Delphi study because they want to see what your instrument is. They have no intent of actually participating. So you may see your greatest fallout between the number of people who register to be in and say they want to be in your study to those who basically get the round one and then you don't hear from them again. And it could be that they're interested, or it also could be that they didn't realize, gee, I've got to write answers to all these questions and I don't have the time to do it. The dropout in between the other rounds is a little bit fewer, but still exists. And typically the Likert surveys go a lot faster than sitting there having to write. What's the appropriate panel size and what's the N? You're going to get all sorts of interpretations in that, anywhere from 10 up to 100 or more participants. You'll also get divergence in opinion as to if panel size can be smaller if the panel is homogeneous in terms of expert criteria, but if you're bringing in different groups of stakeholders with different types of experience, the panel size needs to be larger. Again, there's not a consistent understanding on that. So where I seem to guide my students is a good panel size is about 25, and that leaves for about a 25% dropout rate. So we're still, upwards in the high teens and ending up in terms of the number of participants. The second thing to be careful of is invitation letter clarity. Ensure the panelist recruitment letters that the students send out are emphasizing that the panelists are being approached because of their knowledge of the problem, that they're not going to be asked proprietary information about their organizations. That raises all sorts of issues in terms of permissions. And again, this will vary by IRB, and I recommend you check with the Walden IRB. But at other universities, if you are recruiting a participant through the email or the phone lines of a corporation, you are now crossing their servers. So even though the study may not be about the organization, you still need permissions to do that. Whereas if you go into a social media platform like LinkedIn, post an invitation, and ask people to respond to you with their personal email addresses and contact information, you're bypassing the organization. This study is not about the organization, and it becomes up to the participant whether they want to disclose to their organization that they're going to be part of this study and follow any protocol set up by the organization. Again, I would check and confirm with an IRB as to whether or not they accept those practices that I am just saying. But at the outset, it's very important to make it clear you are not asking proprietary or confidential information about where the person is employed. Third landmine to avoid, I call this the needle in the haystack. So despite all the protections of anonymity, identifiers, encryption, password protected files, secure data storage, you want to make sure that the sample frame of your experts is sufficiently large to mitigate against the speculation of participant involvement. If there's only 50 people in the United States that meet these expert requirements, and your panel has 25 people on it, well, it's going to be clear to the readers that there's a high likelihood that Ken Sherman, might have been part of this study. So despite all best intentions, you want to make sure that your sample frame of experts is sufficiently large to mitigate the speculation of participant involvement. Again, that's an IRB issue, and I would try to get some sort of sense or understanding as to the sensitivities around that. Okay, the fourth one, landmine to avoid. And again, these are numbered back into the map so you can see where they occur. The data and the research questions are not aligned. So you're going out in one direction and you're not connecting back to your study. So a good example would be a research question that says, what are forward-looking strategies for church leaders to employ to drive a millennial affiliation in churches? And then the interview question, the open-ended question you send out to your participants is, why don't millennials affiliate with churches? Well, you're going to get the whys, but you're not going to necessarily add to that. Your participants aren't going to be telling you the strategies. So that, you would then have to conclude that as a researcher, and you're overlaying your own bias onto the answers as opposed to asking specifically about those strategies. So making sure that the interview questions answer or provide or will inform the research question, as with any study, is critical. Fifth, inconsistent constructs. Students who do qualitative research, and again, for me, this is true regardless of the design, don't necessarily come in with the same basic disciplines when we do quantitative research, where we have constructs, operationalization of the construct, and so on. So often you're going to see that students, to be creative and don't want to be boring and repetitive, change around the wording. So a student wanted to propose a Delphi of new programs to address minimizing student conflict in public schools. So throughout the proposal, she referred to strategies, techniques, approaches to minimizing conflict. They're not the same. She refers to consensus as to peer mediation, and then she refers to consensus for conflict resolution. Again, one might be a subset of the other, but they're not the same. And then she refers to, implementation of programs, and then she refers to the content of programs. Well, that's not the same. And so, and I pull my hair out with students because invariably you've got all of these inconsistencies and constructs. Be sure that there's almost a hierarchy or some sort of taxonomic classification that the students are using at the very beginning, so as not to confuse the panelists and not to mix apples and oranges and, I guess, kiwis and other things to come up with fruit salad. Very quickly, there's a flawed data analysis plan. You notice that in my example that I gave you, I separated tools and techniques. Sometimes students will take all that and put it into one bucket, and then they might ask people to rank the top 5 answers. Well, in doing that, your panelists might not rank as highly the techniques as the tools, or vice versa, and you're going to be eliminating data. So depending on what you want to drive consensus, you need to make sure that you are segregating the data into the proper buckets and that you're running the data analysis and data reduction within those buckets. You're not putting everything into one large bucket. Okay. Another landmine, and oh boy, this one, I had to become the alchemist because, again, as I said, you learn from experience. And so in this one, my student took all the thematic responses from round 1 and decided that, this one looks like this one, and this one looks like that, and this one looks like that, and eliminated all the nuances. and wound up with statements that anybody would have agreed to. And so she was getting 100% consensus, and she eliminated all the differentiation and the nuance. So when everything looks the same, what's there to disagree with? So that round one analysis is very important to ensure you're coming up with a sufficient number of differentiated alternatives. Landmine number 8. You can't click your heels 3 times and go back to Kansas. You basically need to ensure that when an analysis is done for one round, that it is correct and there's no errors. Because if there are, you're carrying those errors then into the next survey and into the next survey. And you're not going to, at the end of round 3, to say to everybody, oh, by the way, there were some mistakes. Let's, start the clock again. So errors in data collection in round 1 impact credibility and trustworthiness of data for subsequent rounds and conclusions. I will tell you that every dissertation I chaired, even with my best and my brightest students, has had data analysis errors. And so personally, I go in and I look at the data and I make sure that the medians are calculated correctly, that the frequencies were calculated correctly, and that there was sufficient variation in the round 1s to ensure that we're going to get responses that we're looking for by the end of the study. Landmine number 9, student is not working efficiently. One of the upsides to a Delphi study is because there are these separate rounds. As the students are pushing out the survey for the next round and participants are taking the week or 10 days to complete the survey, the student could be writing up the results of the prior round. So it's a really nice and efficient way to kind of move the student along so they're not just sitting there, twiddling their thumbs and waiting. Delphi, there are fans and critics. On the pro side, very quickly, the experts increase the content validity. Studies have been done by showing the forecasts that will come out of a Delphi study have actually been shown to work, by and large. Opinions of all participants are heard. It's anonymous. Nobody is dominating the group. Consensus isn't necessary, for findings to be of meaning. As I said in the example, that there wasn't a lot of consensus as to that which was desirable. So one of the interpretations might be, how do we make this desirable as part of future research studies? It's broadly used both in academic and business environments, and you're mixing scientific evidence with social value as opposed to doing just purely a quant analysis. The con is lack of standards. There's so many different ways to do this, it's hard to compare findings of studies. The completeness of the questionnaires are questioned in terms of the scope of the data that's being collected. As I've mentioned, the selection of experts can place, or the criteria can place the qualitative validity at risk. And there's also the influence of the researcher on how they're measuring and measuring consensus. So finally, credibility and confirmability. Because of all of those cons, what I will also do, and here's the question, how do I mitigate against validity concerns on the con side? Great question. Here's the slide. So one of the things that I will do is, in addition to desirability and feasibility, I will introduce 2 more scales in the 3rd round of the study, and then the final results of the study. And I call this the importance and the confidence scale. They're all based upon work of Lindstone and Turoff, which I'm going to give you the reference to in a minute. And in this case, we don't use importance and confidence for the data reduction, but we do use it as a measure of qualitative validity. And we ask the participant to rate, again, strongly agree to strongly disagree as to the importance of each item and to the confidence that they have in the accuracy of the information that they are reporting. We also will send out the final results to the study, and with a single Likert item, we will ask the participant to rate their confidence in the overall results of the study. Those are 2 ways to do some mitigation. Okay, over here in the slides, there's tons of references. I think for the novice researcher, These are very, very good references. The first one is the one that I mentioned, which is the Bible that I use. This was actually based on a dissertation that was published into a book that's sold by Springer on their website. You don't need to buy the whole book. You can go in and buy the chapter. It's $29.95. It's the best $29.95 I have ever spent in my life. He provides a detailed analysis relative to every one of the methodology components, all the variations, points you to the studies where there are these variations, and then discusses the thoughts of methodologists as to which may be better choices than others. Lindstone and Turoff, there's very few books. This is the classic book. It's about 700 pages. You can download it for free. They released their copyright on it, and you can download this off the internet. Here's the website published by the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Skolmowski and Hartman, it's heavily concentrated in information technology studies, but it's applicable across the full range of Delphi research. And again, we'll discuss some of the variations in methodology. And finally, here's another book that can be referred to. It's in the Google Book Collection. And while it addresses nursing and health research, the methodological issues and comparisons that it raises, I believe, are applicable to all Delphi studies. We'll come up to questions. The reference list, again, will give you the full APA formatted references to these resources. And I encourage you, I mean, he's my guy. This is great. This piece that he did over here. And you've got Lindstone and Turoff as well. Here's the study that I did, which is published in the Consulting Psychology Journal for Practice and Research on building consensus on defining success of diversity work in organizations, and so on. All right, let me just go back up here. See if there's any questions. How do you decide how much information you share in the second round? It's really up to the researcher, and it will also depend on how much you ask as well. So you have the option of asking people in round 2, for example, if they rate something as not desirable or not feasible, you can give them space on the survey to explain why. And I recommend we do that because that really helps later on with analysis. We're not guessing. How much of that you want to part back really is at the discretion of the researcher. Another question, the minimum ends and the percents who drop out, I think we addressed. And I think that's it. If there's any last questions, oh wait, how do we mitigate? We address that. Can we? Yes, you can certainly reach out to me with questions. My email, it's my name, Kenneth.Sherman @mail at God, I should know my own email address it's at mail.waldenu.edu.
I'm putting it in. Perfect.
Right. Try that. That's where you'll find me. There we go. Thank you. I'm glad everybody found this worthwhile. And certainly you can reach out to me. I don't profess to be the guru at this. I am a faculty member who chairs dissertations, has done a number of these studies, but certainly I am still learning as we go along. So thank you again, everybody, for your time and your patience. And again, good research ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you all for attending, and we appreciate you sticking on the line. I will be sending out a recording to the webinar, so please check your inboxes for that. I'll also include a link to the PowerPoints and the documents that Dr. Sherman had uploaded into the session as well. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you, Dr. Sherman, for a fabulous presentation. Bye-bye.